Hello and welcome to this video summarising all you need to know about the book Sense and Sensibility by Jane Austen. This video will not only summarise the book itself but also look at the key characters that you should be aware of in addition to the themes and symbols. But before we go into it, it's important to understand context, the issues that were surrounding the book, including the author at the time. So the first thing to be aware of is that this was Jane Austen's first book before her most famous title, Pride and Prejudice. Sense in this context refers to wisdom and judgment, and Elinor is described as a sensible character in this novel. Sensibility is described as sensitivity and emotion, and Marianne is seen as the positive one. This book at the time was published anonymously. As you can see in the image, it's by a lady. And the focus of this book, like many of her other books, is on the upper middle class in England and their obsession with maintaining their status. This novel established what would become Jane Austen's famous literary style. She had a special focus on characters and their personalities. Symbols and other literary devices came second to the people she was creating. And her style, in terms of her writing, was known for being very sharp, witty, but also very subtle. It seemed as if she often pokes fun at her own characters and also at the class which she belongs to. So do bear in mind that Jane Austen herself was from the upper class of Britain. This novel also showcases her use of irony. Characters often say one thing when they really mean another. In terms of a summary, Mr. Henry Dashwood dies. This is where the novel begins, and he leaves all of his money to his son from his first wife, John. His second wife and her 3 daughters are left homeless and with very little income. They move to stay with distant relatives, the Middletons. The girls discover many new acquaintances like Colonel Brandon and John Willoughby. Willoughby begins courting Marianne, but leaves suddenly for business in London. Anne and Lucy Steele, 2 relatives of Lady Middleton, arrive as guests. Lucy befriends Elinor and informs her that she has been engaged to Mr. Ferrars for a year. Mr. Ferrars is John's brother-in-law and a close friend of Elinor's. This really saddens her. Elinor and Marianne travel to London, and Colonel Brandon tells them that everyone is talking about an engagement between Marianne and Willoughby, though he has not as yet proposed. She sees Willoughby at a party, but cruelly he rebuffs her and tells her that he never had feelings for her. Colonel Brandon tells Elinor that Willoughby's history, and he says that he's run out of money and he's marrying the wealthy Miss Grey instead. Lucy's older sister accidentally reveals Lucy and Ferrars's engagement, and his mother is angry. Marianne falls deathly ill, and Willoughby, hearing of her illness, rushes to see her, begging for her forgiveness. Marianne says she could have never been happy with him, and she begins to recover. Lucy decides to marry Ferrars's brother in the end, and Ferrars proposes to Elinor. Marianne and Colonel Brandon then become engaged. Now, when it comes to key characters, the main characters are the Dashwood sisters. So Elinor, Marianne and Margaret. And Marianne is the most sensible one, who falls for Willoughby but ultimately marries Colonel Brandon. Elinor, who's the oldest, supports her sister while yearning for Ferrars. And Margaret, the youngest, has her sister's romantic tendencies. The other key characters are Edward and Robert Ferrars. Edward is the older brother who's stuck in a secret engagement with Lucy but ends up marrying Elinor. Robert inherits the family money after Edward is disinherited and eventually marries Lucy. Colonel Brandon is another important character, and he's portrayed as a very honourable and respectful man who falls in love with Marianne. In terms of themes to be aware of, the first is obviously, as the title suggests, sense and sensibility. So sense in this instance is linked to reason, restraint and clear-headedness. These were all key virtues that Victorian men and women were expected to have. But it also aligned with values of the neoclassical movement. Sensibility, on the other hand, deals with emotion and sensitivity, which is much more aligned with Romanticism, which really valued the individual emotions over society's more constraining views on how individuals must be. These are 2 eras that Austen was on the cusp of. So she was based when the Romantic era in the 1700s was coming to an end, and the Victorian era, which was much more restrictive, was at its start. The two girls both have a mix of these traits, showing the need to balance both. Women are another important factor in terms of themes, and as in many of her novels, the women in this story are far more real and fleshed out than we normally see in books of this time. The women in this novel don't always act polite and proper, which is interesting when you consider Jane Austen's novels in comparison to other novels published at the time. They are portrayed instead as having emotions, including passion, hate, and frustration. They have many dimensions and are just as believable as people as the men. Another theme is that of expectation versus reality. So many of the characters are not who they seem in this novel. We're led to believe that Willoughby is a good and romantic man, but as it turns out, he is not, and a poor choice. Lucy still also gives false pretenses, coming out as a very conniving and clever girl, despite her innocent appearance. And Austen often shows us that characters are not always as they appear, and they sometimes say and do things that are at odds with their true natures. So that's all. If you found this video useful, do give us a thumbs up and subscribe to our channel for more revision guides and resources. Thank you so much for listening.